Welcome to the Wine Yogi. I'm your guide, Crystal, and I'm here to help you navigate your way through the wonderful world of wine and all its heady associates, craft beers, spirits, and gourmet foods, with the knowledge of a sommelier, the sometimes calm patience of a yoga instructor, and of course the wacky humor of a former Air Force pilot, stay-at-home mama, and a girl raised in the South. So let's get chatting about wine. Welcome to this episode of the Wine Yogi. Today, I'm approaching a milestone with this podcast. I am getting really close to a total of 50 podcasts, which, wow, holy cow. I didn't really think I had that much to talk about, but apparently I do. But I wanted to take a minute. I'm not at 50 yet. I'm going to do something special for the Big 5-0. Well, I mean, I'm going to do something special when I turn 50 as well, but for my 50th podcast, I'll do something fun. Maybe I'll actually just do a wine tasting while I'm recording the podcast. That might be fun. But I wanted to take a minute, and since we've been going at this for quite a while now, I wanted to circle back on some terminology and concepts related to both winemaking, the growing of grapes to produce wine, tasting of wine, etc., just to kind of recap all the things that we've discussed in one easy podcast. I am also actually going to link to my blog where you can read along if you would like, or maybe print it up for later reference, or to have a nice handy. I am going to include a nice handy one-sheet tasting note that can help guide you through each of your tastings, regardless of whether you're doing it over dinner, with friends, maybe you're having a party that you want to actually, have everybody kind of participate and figure out what they're enjoying. But so this essentially is the second semester of Wine Basics. So we've already had Wine 101. So now it's going to be Wine 201. So we're in our second semester. It is the spring semester, so it's appropriate. We're coming up on spring break, so you can expect probably your midterm exam, maybe around episode 50. I don't know. Could happen. So let's get started talking about some of your basic terminology that you will come across when you're exploring the wonderful world of wine. The first term that I'm going to use is a very common one, but it still can cause some confusion, and that is the term varietal. Now, varietal just refers to a specific variety of Vitis vinifera. So that's going to be our second term. So I'm going to go ahead and just explain Vitis vinifera. Vitis vinifera is the official name of the particular strain of grapes that produces wine. You have different levels within Vitis vinifera. You have your older grapes. You have your more modern grapes that, thanks to DNA and genome mapping, more and more grapes are being recognized as Vitis vinifera. But what Vitis vinifera is not, these varietals are not your common table grape, your red seedless, your green seedless, or even the ones with seeds, those big, fat, juicy, sweet grapes that we enjoy that turn into delicious grape jam and jelly or grape juice are not the kind of grapes that are used traditionally to make wine. Now, as I mentioned, Vitis vinifera is the Latin name for the grapes that are native to that Mediterranean and Fertile Crescent areas where all of these grapes that we now use in modern winemaking can connect to. That's their heredity. So if they did their 23andMe, it would all stem from those grapes that first were discovered. I mean, who knows which people actually discovered them, but were first transported throughout the Mediterranean by the Greeks, then later the Romans, God bless them with their roads, spread them all throughout Europe. So you have one strain of a grape type, a varietal, that stems from Vitis vinifera. Now, we do have North American native grapes that can also be used to make wine. And these varietals, and yes, we still use that term when describing, say, a muscadine wine from Duplin County in the Carolinas. When you're describing varietals that are not Vitis vinifera, while they are still going to be classified as wine, They will have some unique characteristics that you will not find in your more traditional Vitis vinifera. More modern North American native grapes tend to have a foxy or very earthy, musky smell to them and taste. They also tend to be much sweeter, and that's simply because these are the grapes that we use to make grape jam and jelly that we eat from the table, or that we use to make grape juice. So they're naturally sweeter. They just have a higher sugar content. Their acid is much lower. And so when you start looking at how wine is made, and so this is going to go into our third term, when we start looking at viticulture and viniculture. Viticulture is how grapes are grown. Viniculture is how wine is made. So when we are looking at viniculture, it all relates back to the vineyard where the grapes were grown. So what plays into these things? The wine that you are drinking in your glass right now began as that grapevine, and believe it or not, grapevines do not produce fruit right away. Like most fruit trees, bushes, things like that, it takes several years for the vines to be mature enough to start developing fruit. But there is a cycle for the development of grapes. It begins, if you think right now where we're getting ready to come up. In fact, the day this podcast is going to be published is the first official day of spring. But right around this time, throughout the northern hemisphere, vineyards across the world are starting to experience bud break. And that is where the vines have started to grow. They're starting to produce those buds. And then as it begins to warm up, those buds are going to start breaking, and then the flowers come forth, and then you're going to start producing the actual fruit. So this usually, on average, takes about 3 years from when you've planted the root stock, and that's another term, root stock, from once you've planted that vine before you're going to get to the point where actual grapes are going to be produced on your grapevine. And in the interim, in each year, there will be certain cycles where you're caring for that vine, how it's going to be pruned out, how much sun it's going to see, how much foliage you're going to allow, how much you're going to water. All of these things factor into the production of fruit. So once you've reached the point where the vine is capable of producing the grapes, then you're going to move into the very active cycle at a vineyard, because there's a lot going on. It's not just about letting the vines go and they're just going to naturally produce all this amazing fruit. You, as the winemaker, most winemakers take a hands-on approach. They're going out into the vineyard. They're walking amongst their vines. They're looking at the grapes. They're looking at the weather. They're looking at the soil, looking for any indication of fungus, rot, all sorts of things. So there's a lot going on. It's not a very hands-off process. So we'll just assume that you, as the experienced winemaker, have taken all the necessary steps. Your vines are producing. The fruit has set. So you're starting to produce the actual fruit. And just like with any other type of fruit, it's going to ripen as it's on the vine, and that's known as veraison. So veraison is going to be another term that you'll frequently see, and it is that moment when these green, small, hard clumps of not much there. And if you were to bite into it, nothing but acid, no fruit, no sugar whatsoever in the fruit. But this is that moment when those small, tiny, great green grapes begin to develop into juicier clusters, and that more traditional of what you see. They may shift into a calmer looking green. They're not going to be that super bright neon green. They may begin to mutate into red or turn into those darker colors, maybe even purple or black. This is a very important time for the grapes themselves and for the future wine that they will hopefully produce, because what's happening now as the grapes are maturing and they're turning into this amazing fruit, it all depends on the temperature. And so what you're looking for are warm days, but not too warm. You don't want to burn the grapes and turn them into raisins on the vine. So you don't want intense amount of sun, but it needs to be warm enough that when it drops off, the temperature drops off at night, you're looking for kind of a 30-degree temperature swing. So you want those 80+ degree days, and then those cooler 50-degree-ish below, to 60-degree evenings that you might need a light jacket when you go out in the evening. And the reason why is that is going to begin to affect the acid that's being produced and the sugar that's being produced within the grape itself. And what the winemaker is doing, especially when we're starting to get closer to the fall and harvest is getting ready to take place, what they're looking for is a balance between the sugar and the acid in that grape itself. And when it reaches the level that they're looking for, depending on the type and style of wine they want to produce, that will then key when they're going to begin to harvest the grapes to take them into their next cycle, removing them from the vine, bringing them into the winery to start producing wine. So once that happens, and there are lots of different ways that they harvest. They can harvest by machine, which is obviously the most, it's going to be the fastest way. It's not the best way, simply because you lose a lot of your stock, the grapes themselves, in that process. They can be damaged. And, if you've got crushed berries because a machine is crushing them while it's harvesting them, that's just lost product going out onto the soil. If you harvest by hand, which a lot of vineyards do, then you're kind of controlling which group you're taking at one point. In fact, when you're harvesting, say, Auslese, Spätlese and Auslese Rieslings in Germany, there's a particular technique that you have to actually have of what's going in for an Auslese and what's going in for a Spätlese. So that's a whole other podcast. So once you get the grapes off the vines, all of it goes into crush. Okay, so all of it starts clear as a juice itself when it's crushed, and this is the foot stomping. So remove those shoes. Make sure your feet are clean. Hop into a barrel and start stomping like Lucille Ball. That's one of my favorite episodes. But what happens is if you're making a white wine, you're going to rack that juice off of the skins. So often what you hear is that the red wines are going to be macerating and kissing the skins while they're fermenting. So while most grapes are sent through a process where the stems are removed, a little bit's going to get in there, and that is going to introduce tannins, which I'm going to circle back to tannins in just a minute. But everything else is kind of going in there. It's kind of a big process, especially at some of your bigger winemaking facilities. Some of your smaller winemaking facilities where they are producing, under 300 cases, things like that, you're definitely going to have a little bit more hands-on in terms of the process, and it's pretty neat to even watch some of the more antique crushers as they spin a weight down in this barrel to crush the grapes to extract the juice. So after the crushing, the stems have been removed, they're going to be put into tanks for fermentation. The red grapes are going to go in with the skins. The white grapes are probably going to not have that time. They're going to be racked off, as I said, because you want to minimize that contact with the skins, the seeds, and any stem that may be in there. So all of that for red wine isn't as big of a deal. Now, it does depend on the red wine that you're making. Also depends on if you're doing a rosé. So what usually happens in that press is they'll rack off that juice right away, so it's minimal contact, and then they're going to put that clear juice into a stainless steel tank, or believe it or not, they use these really huge plastic-based tanks as well for fermentation. It just depends on the winemaker. And then that's where the magic starts to happen. So there is typically a primary fermentation process, and that is where a yeast is going to be introduced into the grape must. So once that actually occurs. And so with red wine, typically those skins and all that stuff is still involved. The juice hasn't been pressed off of that or racked off of that yet. But once that starts, the yeast begins to consume the sugar. It's going to release a couple of things. Carbon dioxide is one thing that fermentation process will release. You may be most familiar with that when you're making yeast bread and you put a little warm water, sugar, and yeast in a measuring cup, and you just kind of mix it up, and then you start watching it bubble. So that's CO2 that's being released as the yeast consumes the sugar. The other thing that this yeast, as it's consuming the grape must and the sugars in the grape juice, is going to release is going to be that alcohol that's going to turn it into wine, turn this water into wine. So depending on what type of wine you're making, perhaps things are going to be halted at a certain point if you want a lower alcohol, higher sugar type of wine, or perhaps you're still wanting the sugar content, but you're going to add more alcohol in it to kill the yeast and stop that process. Or you can actually chill and drop the temperature on the fermentation if you're trying to make, say, a sparkling wine in a traditional champagne method. So from there, at that point, that's where things begin to diverge between reds and whites even more than they already have. And so you may have one fermentation for your lighter white wines, or you may have a secondary fermentation known as malolactic fermentation. And there are some white wines that will go through the malolactic fermentation. Chardonnay is the primary one, and all red wine will go through a malolactic fermentation. And what happens is the malic acid, and that's that green apple, extremely tart, really grips on your teeth. That gets converted into a creamier, smoother lactic acid. And so in Chardonnay, especially Chardonnay that's seen some oak, that can come across as being buttery. And that is a common note, especially from New World Chardonnays that have seen that malolactic fermentation and spent time in, say, American oak. In red wine, that malolactic fermentation, instead of producing a butter note, may start bringing out some of the earthier tastes, such as you might start getting kind of the almond note coming off, maybe even getting into more of your spices like, cinnamon, nutmeg, those things that have kind of almost that nut component to them as well. And it definitely provides a smoother and bigger mouth feel. Now, once the wine has gone through its fermentation process, that's where it now is either going to be racked, bottled, but there's another step that's going to go in there as well before you're actually going to put that wine into a bottle, and that is going to be the fining process. So most higher quality wine is not going to be sent through a coffee filter. A lot of other mass-produced wines that are out there that are not on that higher end of the spectrum or the boutique end or aiming for a certain quality may actually go through a filter system to remove any remaining residue from the press or from the yeast cells, whatever is left from the winemaking process. Now, I'll just say it, the nicer wines, the better wines, are going to achieve that by racking. So they're going to rack the wine, moving it from barrel to barrel to barrel, container to container, to prevent the sediment that we can see with our eyes from ending up in the final bottle. Sometimes it still happens, especially if you have any type of organic, unfiltered, unfined wine out there. And sometimes it's just a natural process of the wine itself. It's going to have some Scooby snacks. That's what I like to call them. That's that grit that you may find around your glass. You'll see that often with wines as they are also aging if you are collecting wines and are actually laying them down for a period of time. So this is also the time where they will add some sulfites. Traditionally, that's going to be, you're going to need them more in white wines than in red wines, although most people associate my sulfite reaction with the red wine. Believe it or not, the sulfites that occur in red wine are more naturally occurring. You don't have to add as much. There's a lot of other things going on in red wine that help act as preservatives that unfortunately white wine just doesn't have. And that's because of the lack of contact with skins and stems and those tannic principles that are going to be coming in to the palate here in a little while. They also stand to act as a preservative. So almost all wine is going to have some type of sulfur or sulfite in it. But there is also a technique used called fining that removes proteins and excess tannins that may make your wine cloudy or intensify certain aspects that you're not looking for, like bitterness or extreme levels of metallic ammonia, all of those types of things. You don't want that in your wine. So winemakers go through a process known as fining. And this is where the question comes in about wines being vegan or not. So while in the traditional sense, wine is vegetarian, not all wine is vegan. In fact, most wine is not. And that is simply because of what winemakers use to fine their wine. So with red wines, they are using the protein from an egg. So the egg whites themselves, not the yolk, the whites. And that pulls out any of those other proteins. It acts as a glue, and it attracts it all. In fact, that's how most broth is made too, is you drop egg whites into broth. And that pulls out all that fat and everything like that to clear up your broth so it's not cloudy. And so if you've ever made your own broth at home, you look at it in the jar and you're like, wow, that does not look like what comes out of a can or a box. Well, that's why, because you haven't done that process. It makes a little float at the top of your stock pot. For white wines, they often use ground up fish bones. And again, they don't leave it in there. This is just a process to pull out any of the remaining things that we can't see with the visible eye, but that impact the wine overall, whether it's how it looks in the glass or how it tastes or the nose. And that's where you come up with that term fine wine. It's been fined. And that helps avoid the filtering process, because unfortunately the filtering process, you're now going to introduce whatever's on that filter. So maybe it's a bleach filter, maybe it, a coffee filter, whatever. But you're going to be introducing notes from that process that's going to impart its flavor profile. So if you ever are tasting your wine, you're like, tastes like a Melita number 4, and you're probably drinking a wine that went through a filter. And that's okay. There's a place for all wine at my table, except for white Zinfandel. And if you've been listening to the podcast, you know why. So then, depending on the wine, the next step is aging. And most of your wines that are going to be aged are going to go into either oak barrels. The preponderance of barrels come from France. You can get some Czechoslovakia. Well, it's not Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. You can get barrels from that Central Europe and then the United States. So the French barrels tend to be pretty neutral, very soft. American barrels tend to have a little bit more zip to them, often are known for imparting dill flavors on the wines. And then same with the Czech. Those barrels can also have some pretty strong notes that can come across like a tar almost. But once they've gone through their aging process, and it's different for every type of varietal, how long they're going to spend some time in oak, and it may not be all the same oak. Sometimes they'll spend however many months in French, however many months in American, things like that. It's what the winemaker's trying to achieve with their final product. But then after that, you're going to rack and bottle. So again, that racking is that natural way of filtering without actually sending it through a filter. And then they're going to begin to bottle. Now, some wines will go through their aging process is in the bottle, and that's when you're looking at doing, for example, sparkling wines in the traditional champagne method. If you see the term on your sparkling wine, traditional method, let's say your sparkling wine is not from Champagne. If it's from Champagne, it's done in this method. And if it's cava, it's done in this method. But if it's a sparkling wine, say from California or from Germany or from elsewhere in France or in Italy, and it's following the method developed in Champagne in France, then you'll see things like traditional method, method traditionnelle, method champenoise, things like that. That's going to indicate the manner in which that wine was made. Now, if you are looking at other sparkling wines that don't have that listed, perhaps a Prosecco, some of your Moscato d'Astis, that's when you're going to start getting into another method known as tank method. And that's where instead of allowing the wines to ferment for their secondary fermentation to build up that CO2 in the bottle and capturing it like they do in the traditional method, they're doing this in a tank, and then they're going to bottle it. And then your very inexpensive sparkling wines, very inexpensive, the ones that give you really rotten headaches, often served at weddings, those kinds. They're usually done in the Coca-Cola method. They've had the CO2 added into a still wine, and that makes it bubbly. And that's pretty much why, it's the bottom end. Avoid those. Go with tank or traditional method, and then you'll be good. So let's quickly go over a couple of terms you may hear or use when you're actually going through a tasting. So let's first talk about color. So that's when you're actually going to be looking at the color of the wine. You don't just look at it as it sits in the glass. Some people swirl. What swirling does is introduces oxygen into the wine if it needs it to help it open up a little more. That's known as breathing. But once you start to do that, once you're exposing that wine to oxygen, that wine is going to start changing. So the minute that cork comes out of the bottle and is exposed to oxygen, that wine is going to start changing. And for some wines, it's amazing. It's such a beautiful transformation. They may be really, really not quite right, tight, just off-putting for whatever reason when you first open. An hour later, they're starting to become a little bit more drinkable. 2 hours later, 24 hours later, it's amazing to see the difference. So when we're looking at color, you can give it a little swirl if you want, but ideally you're going to tip that glass basically parallel to the table and without spilling. And the reason why is you want to look at the color not only around the edge of the wine itself, around that rim, that watery towards the rim of your glass. You're looking down through the glass at the bowl, so at the base where there's the most wine concentrated. And I like to put mine in front of white paper or something white, a white napkin, and ideally, especially if I'm looking at red wines to determine how translucent they are, something with words on it. And if I can read words, through the wine, obviously it's translucent. And if I can't, it's obviously opaque. So when you're first looking at a glass of wine, you're going to look for a couple of things as indications. Is it cloudy? Is it hazy? Is it clear? And then does it kind of have a little sparkle to it? Does it actually have some bubbles to it? If it's a sparkling wine, bonus. That's great. You want bubbles. If it's not a sparkling wine, bubbles may be something to be concerned about. It may indicate something went wrong with the wine. A secondary fermentation may have happened. So once you determine your color, and that's where you want to reach back into your childhood and bring out your Crayola 56, because there's all kinds of different striations of color. And so that's when you're going to start hearing people describe things as, pale straw, light gold, deep gold, green tinged, things like that. So you want to have a good grasp on your colors, because a lot of times folks get very confused, especially when you get into reds, because the reds, they range from ruby red to blood red to brick red to black to purple to magenta, all kinds of different colors. So definitely it's fun just to kind of also remember all of the names of your crayons from your childhood. So I like to I don't need to really swirl my white wines other than I'm checking out if I can see if there are legs present, and that's how slow the wine trickles back down from as you take it out towards the rim and opening down. I just give it a couple of good swirls just to wake it up, especially if it's straight out of a bottle. And that way I can also start to take in the nose. The nose is what we smell. So first we see the wine with our eyes. Now we're going to smell it. And I don't just dive right in with my nose. I kind of start far away, about a foot away. And I want to see where I'm going to start picking up the smell of the wine. And sometimes you may just catch just a little bit of something very briefly. Once I get my nose up to it, I like to close my eyes. I remove my glasses. It's a very therapeutic yoga exercise in mindfulness. And then I'll put my nose down at the base of my glass, and I tip the wine so that the wine is just almost to my nose. And I'm going to take a few deep breaths and just kind of see what my first impressions are. Is the wine off? Does it have a wet dog, wet cardboard smell? If it has these strange smells that smell like canned asparagus, sulfur, like rotten eggs, or wet dog, wet cardboard, a basement that's flooded, that musty smell, there's probably something off with the wine. There may be an issue going on known as basically that's what we call corked wines. There could be other faults that cause those smells as well. But for the most part, if you smell that wet dog, that your wine is corked, and it's a little bug that lives on naturally occurring cork, and it affects about 10 to 12% of most wine produced in the world that uses natural cork. So if you have a corked wine, and even if you're not sure, don't drink it. Just let it sit there. If you come back 2 hours later and that smell is even stronger and it really smells now like wet newspaper, cardboard, basement flooded, then pour the wine from your glass back in to your wine bottle, put your cork back into the bottle, and take it back to the store you bought it from, because that wine is bad, and if they're reputable, will take it back and replace it. So as I'm smelling on the nose, I like to go, I start by first, putting my nose in there and making sure there's no fault. And if it smells nice and pleasant, then I'm going to go back in and start trying to pull out what I'm actually smelling. And this is, again, going to harken back to your childhood, to the road maps that were created as you were growing up and your nose was first introduced to the world. So whether it's things like tobacco, because you grew up around it, or maybe your mom or grandma was a gardener, so you grew up around all of these herbs or, vegetables, and so you can pick those notes out. Maybe you grew up around horses and you spent a lot of time out in barns or out in pastures, so maybe hay, manure. Believe it or not, that is something you can find. Maybe it just comes down to what you smell when you go into a grocery store, a hardware store, whatever it is. So I always encourage folks, because they'll say, I can't smell any of those things. You got to train your nose. Your sense of smell is like any other muscle that we have. If we don't use it, then we lose it. So that's what your French teacher probably told you back in the 9th grade. If you don't parler the français, you're going to lose it. So next time you go to the grocery store and you fill up, you bring home a bag full of veggies, smell them before you put them away. Just kind of stick in one podcast, I suggested walking around the grocery store. But then I had visions of people sticking their faces down into the green salads and causing a ruckus. So if you're not comfortable picking fruit up at the grocery store and sniffing it, that's okay. Sniff it when you get home. That's how I tell when things are ripe, though. Whether it's my honeydew or cantaloupe or pineapple, I have to pick it up and smell it. So take a moment, walk through a hardware store, go through the concrete area, go through the wood section, smell all the different striations of wood, go through your the actual where you have the screws and nails and everything, smell that metal. Walk through and expose your nose to all of these different smells if you have a hard time pulling these things out. I have a really sensitive sense of smell. I have an extremely sensitive sense of taste. So it's not that difficult for me to start picking things out. Now, I encourage you, don't read what the winemaker says. Because if you turn the bottle over and it's a New World wine and they describe to you blackberry, cocoa, hints of anise, finished with dark leather and tobacco, you're going to smell all that stuff. It's subliminal messaging. And so smell it first before you start reading. Come up with your own wine note to describe the wine that you're trying. So we've discussed legs. Legs indicate alcohol, and you can kind of see, gives you a good indication of how big the wine is going to be. A lot of your lighter wines, they're not going to linger. It's not going to take very long for that wine to trickle right back down into the bowl. some of the bigger wines, they got a lot of stuff going on, not just alcohol, but tannins. It's just a bigger wine in general. And so that may encourage those legs to be a little longer. So it's the trickle from when you swirl the glass, how long it takes the wine to go back down into the bowl. Palate. So once we've done smelling, and I do alternate nostril breathing, so I'll sniff my wine with my right nose, I'll sniff nostril, I'll sniff it with my left, I'll put my nose at the top of the glass, I'll move my nose all around the glass trying to pull things out. And you'll be amazed after a little practice how much you smell on one side versus the other. And then what one side, like randomly, my left side will pick up just weird things. You're like, what? Where did that come from? So once we're ready to taste, though, the first taste is kind of your throwaway taste. You're really not going to pick up anything, and especially if it's the very first wine you're tasting at a tasting. That's why I like Prosecco, because it's light, it's crisp, it's bubbly, it wakes up your taste buds. So I typically, believe it or not, I swoosh a little bit of that just to kind of hit all the taste buds, get it through my mouth, kind of swirl it around, again, introducing more oxygen, but I'm not really pinpointing what I'm tasting at that point. Then I'm going to take another sip. And that's where I'm going to let it linger. I'm going to roll it back over the tongue, slowly bringing it around before I swallow, and I'm a really bad sommelier. I'm sorry. I don't spit. If I like it, I'm going to drink it. So that's why I'll never be like super grand master champion. That will never be me. I can't do that. But at that point, that's when you're going to start jotting down what is it that you're tasting. You're also going to want to notice what's happening in the mouth itself. So the minute the wine hits your mouth, things are going to start activating, whether it's not just your taste buds, what you're tasting. It's the saliva gland. It's how the mouth is going to start drying out. It's how the wine is interacting with your gums. It's what's happening on the tongue, the roof of the mouth, back of the throat, and then as you're swallowing the wine, what happens in the throat itself. So what you're doing is not just pulling out what you're tasting on the palate, but what is happening in the palate. And that's where tannins and acidity come into play. So acidity, you usually have, if you're talking old world wines, you have, and that's wines from Europe. That is where you're going to have multiple layers of acids. So I've already mentioned two of the acids that you can have. You can have malic and lactic. You can also have succinic, which, especially for old world wines, that's that sense after you swallow, it kind of triggers something in the throat as well. It's not like acid reflux. I'm not talking about that. But there's still something going on in the throat, and it's more of an acid. It's not an alcoholic burn. You can just kind of feel that acidity all the way through the throat. Now, New World wines tend to limit their acids present in the wine, and so they're going to pick a certain acid. One of the other most common acids that you'll find, especially in a lot of New World wines, is citric. And we all know what citric tastes like. It's lemon, orange, grapefruit, zest. So that's a preferred acid. And you'll often find that in your lighter white wines. Now, tannins, what acidity does, going back to acidity, what it does is it's going to kick in your saliva glands. And so the minute I feel my saliva gland, especially the one behind your most common saliva gland, is the one that your dental hygienist may tell you about every time you go in for your cleaning, because the back of your bottom front teeth, behind the front teeth, that's a huge saliva gland. And you'll notice right away if it's a highly acidic wine, that's going to kick in almost immediately. Sometimes it takes a hot minute for it to happen, though. And it usually, believe it or not, you do have acidity on old world red wines. Not so much on the New World reds, simply because they're trying to limit that. They want to amp up something else. But in old world wines, you'll tend to find the acids and the tannins, which is what the New World winemakers like to emphasize sometimes, but for the most part. But they're a little bit more comparable and in play with each other, playing off of each other. And the reason why is when we salivate, that is the body's trigger to the brain to tell the brain that the body wants food. Europeans tend to have wine paired with each course. And if you've ever had the pleasure of going to France or Italy or Spain, When they sit down for dinner, they're sitting there for 2 hours. It's a multiple course meal. It's not like us where we're running in and in 40 minutes we have a ginormous plate with everything on one plate. The meal is sent out by course, and the wine is paired based off of each course. Fine dining, fine wine. And so the acid in the wine, whether it's white or red, is meant to encourage that saliva gland to kick in to encourage not only more eating, but also digestion. Now, tannins, on the other hand, this is what can come from the skins of your red wine grapes. It can come from the seeds. If any stems made their way into there, any leaves made their way into that crush and the juice got exposed to it. And then also the oak themselves. And in fact, you can have some white wines that experience some oak tannin. And depending on where the mouth is affected will determine what type of tannin, for the most part, you might be picking up. And the tannins are what I described, so with acidic wines, your mouth waters. With tannins, your mouth dries out. And it may feel like your gums are receding from your teeth. The tongue may be really, really dry, or you may even get a little bit of that salicylic baby aspirin profile in the back of the jaw, where the jaw kind of clamps down because it gets so dry. And so your tannins oftentimes are what especially Americans really enjoy about their big red wines. And that's why it's nice to pair a big red tannic wine, say a Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley, with a big juicy steak, because the mouth has dried out and now I'm going to have a big juicy steak. And so I have my juicy steak and then I have a little bit more wine, and it's a very, very nice pairing. Mouthfeel. Both tannins and acidity can affect mouthfeel, as well as alcohol. Sugar can also play a role in how the wine feels. And this is just overall how it feels in your mouth. Is it smooth, velvety? Is it kind of sharp? Does it burn a little bit? Is it rough with the tannins? Because I took a sip and oh my God, my mouth completely dried out so much to the point that I need to chug, a glass of water. When you are tasting wine, the mouthfeel is that overall experience. And so perhaps if you're having a sweeter wine, it's that wine that kind of lingers. It may have a little viscosity to it, and it just kind of clings to the palate. So when you're jotting down your wine notes, that's one of the things as you're describing tannins, acidity, residual sugar, what you're looking at is mouthfeel. And then you want to just kind of think about what everything is happening in the mouth. Is it balanced? Is it smooth? Does it have some rough edges? Is it sharp? And those are things that you're going to jot down on your note, because those can be indications of either an unbalanced wine, maybe a very young wine. If it doesn't have anything, if it's really flat and there's not much mouthfeel at all, it could be a wine that's kind of gone past its time. It's still drinkable, hasn't turned to vinegar, but it may not have that gorgeous feel that it once had in its youth. Finally, finish. I had mentioned succinic acid, and that's kind of going down into the throat. Finish is often that term that we use to describe what's left over. Sometimes the finish on your higher alcohol wines can be quite long. Sometimes it's because of whether it's sparkling or lower alcohol, or it's just very crisp and clean and very acidic, and then the saliva rinses your mouth out essentially. The finish can be very quick. So as you're tasting your wine, just start to notice, how long am I still tasting this? Is it a very long finish? Is it a medium to long? Or is it very, very short? And again, sometimes that can be indicative of things that might be considered faults with the wine, especially if it's more of an alcoholic burn, or it's a flat wine, or it just kind of leaves that, that's not pleasant kind of going on. There might be an indication of something going wrong. But for the most part, what finish is just kind of wrapping everything up. And if it's a balanced wine, if it's what you're expecting, that finish hopefully will be pleasant. It may not always be pleasant, though, I'm not going to lie. So sometimes it's finish that's going to be driving that, what this wine needs, at least for me. It leads that my brain to start saying, what this wine needs? It needs this food. That's going to make that finish so much better. It's going to make it so much more pleasurable. And so that's when I look at finish and mouthfeel and everything that's happening on the palate, that's when I start thinking about wine and food pairing. And that's going to lead me to my final term before I wrap this podcast up, and that's terroir. Now, terroir actually goes back to your viticulture, how you're growing the grapes. So it's the soil, it's the weather, it's what the French basically used to describe that microclimate where your grapes are growing. But there's also a common assumption, and it's a really good key to pairing wine with your food. And that's, if it grows together, it goes together. So terroir, where it grows and how it grows, is going to influence what you're going to pair that wine with. So if you're having Italian food, have Italian wine. Specifically, let's say if you are having a red sauce, have something from Tuscany that's going to complement it, such as a Sangiovese or a Chianti, which is typically mostly Sangiovese. If you're having French food, same thing. If you're having an American steak, have a Napa Cab. But try to pair your food based off of where it, when you're pairing it with the wine, choose a wine from that region. If you're doing Spanish tapas, or maybe you're doing like lots of Greek or green olives, black olives, manchego, things like that, go with a Spanish wine. And that can begin to help you discover what works well on your palate, pairing different foods with different wines and experimenting. The first place to start is you can go with terroir, and always remember what grows together goes together. Usually. There are some exceptions to that rule. So that's going to wrap it up. I hope you've enjoyed this quick Wine 201 spring semester of your wine terminology and knowledge. Like I said, there's probably going to be a midterm after spring break in a couple weeks, episode number 50. So make sure you tune in. If you want a hard copy of this or something to read and go back and take your time reading, feel free to go check out my blog. I've included a link here. And I would love if you would consider supporting me over on my blog. I'm going to start populating more and more things over there. It's a great way to communicate with me as well. And if you want to find that, if you're not at a computer and you're listening on a podcast, it's super easy, thewineyogi.blog. So until next time, cheers and namaste. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Wine Yogi. Please be sure to check out IamTheWineYogi.com for any updates to my schedule, current yoga classes that I'm offering online, and of course, wine tastings. Also, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast so that you can get updated on all the latest and greatest Wine Yogi podcasts. Until next time, cheers and namaste.